Let's welcome in two of our experts, Danny Kannell and Bryant McFadden here. DK, I'm going to start with you because you put out on Twitter, what is next? So I'm going to ask you that. What's next?
This is the first it's the second domino, right? The first domino we saw last year with Oklahoma, Texas, going to the SEC. And I'm actually surprised that we had to wait an entire year for the next big move. It's been no secret that USC is not long for the Pac-12. And the Pac-12 has a great commitment to academics. And, even during COVID-19, I think that had an impact on this decision as USC was looking around at conferences across the country playing some entire seasons. And even the Big Ten played more football than they did. So I think the USC for the last couple of years has been looking for an opportunity. And with the way the stars aligned, this seems to be the right time. And then who's next? I think there's a list, Amanda, of about 8 to 10 schools who consider themselves national powerhouses. And they're in the remaining conferences that are left over on the outside of these two super conferences that are now created. Clemson, I think, is the school at the top of that list. And it's not many other programs that are in their stratosphere, but there are a bunch who are right under that. Florida State, B. McEnany's alma mater, Miami, Oregon, Washington, Utah. There is a list of schools that are got to be calling up like crazy the Big Ten and the SEC and saying, hey, how can we make something work? What can we do? Like exhausting every single avenue. And if I was one of those schools, I would be doing the exact same thing.
Yeah, and with that being said, Danny, if that was to happen, if you talk about a hypothetical with potentially Clemson leaving the ACC and seeing what happened with Texas and Oklahoma leaving the Big 12, and now currently the newest news with the Pac-12. I mean, basically, college football will only consist of 2 conferences. I know, literally speaking, there are more than 2 conferences, but if that was to happen, my goodness, it's all about the SEC and the Big Ten, especially if the Big Ten can continue to add prestigious like teams, universities to their conference. But in all, this is a huge move for the Big Ten. Mostly known as a Midwest conference, now being able to take their talents out to the West Coast. Look at the TV money that will come in with the Big Ten, now adding 2 powerhouses from the Big 12 in Southern California. I mean, now the recognition, this is a massive move. The Big Ten, locally, money-wise, already just was bringing in a boatload of money, but now potentially adding UCLA and USC. My goodness. This is a huge day for the Big Ten. It's a huge day for the schools that were already involved, and it's a huge day for UCLA and USC as well.
BMAC, so let me ask you this, because a lot of praise for what the Big Ten now looks like. Are they on equal footing now with the SEC?
No question. No question. And think about this, Amanda. We're so football driven that we only oftentimes look at the football side of things. But when you factor in all athletics, all sports, right? The Big Ten is kind of in a league of their own. When you factor in hockey, softball, track, basketball, and add in those 2 powerhouses, when you look at the tradition and the prestige in which they're coming with as well, yes, they're right there with the SEC. And me personally, I know it was a big deal when Oklahoma and Texas decided to go to the SEC. And the SEC was already a powerhouse. That conference football-wise, they don't necessarily need to make that type of move to still be able to dominate college football, but it helped. But in this move right here, this takes the Big Ten to a whole nother level. And they needed to have this to happen to be able to stay within that conversation. So yes, they're right there with the SEC. Clearly, when you talk about football, but if you're talking all sports, me personally, with the money that has been generated already from the Big Ten, I think they're still ahead of the SEC when you factor in all athletics, especially with this move today.
Here's the thing, BMAC, all athletics don't matter. It's about football and it's about basketball. And that one, I do think the SEC still has a pretty massive advantage there with the number of national championships they've had in those. And if you throw in baseball, it's really not even close. Now, this is what I think is a really solid counter punch to the move of Oklahoma, Texas last year. But I don't think it was the there's no knockout blow, but there was one that I think would have been a little bit better, and it's a program that I did not include before when I gave you those 8 to 10 programs. If the Big Ten announced today they were adding USC and Notre Dame, I think that would have been the holy, and this is big. This is a jaw dropper. That would have been bigger. And I still think Notre Dame is out there as a potential option for the Big Ten. So if they were able to add Notre Dame as well, then I think it's okay. Now we can start having that conversation about SEC, Big Ten, equal footing in football and basketball and the major sports that are out there. So I still think there's plenty of moves left, though. I mean, to mention the 2 dominoes that have fallen so far, I don't know when we're going to start hearing these schools trickle in of who's going to be interested now, but I think it puts Notre Dame on the table, who has always been, they've worn their independence with such pride and arrogance even, that I think even they would be willing to start listening to the Big Ten if they came to the table. But they've got this pseudo relationship with the ACC as a sort of 1 foot in with all sports, half foot in with football, that I think Notre Dame even is a potential option for the Big Ten now.
So you got some keys out there. You got schools like Notre Dame, and Danny, you mentioned you think there are about 8 to 10 other schools that consider themselves powerhouses. With the way the Big Ten looks right now, with the way the SEC looks, Danny, you said if you're one of those schools, you're going to be knocking on the door of the Big Ten or the SEC. Is there any way, if you see either some of these conferences joining together, if somebody was able to get Notre Dame, where you feel like they could compete with what the Big Ten and the SEC look like now? Is there any way with those schools that are left out there that you could find some sort of equal footing?
Amanda, when the alliance was formed, I thought that was a really good move for all the conferences involved to kind of counter what the SEC did. But we've seen the alliance completely obliterated with this move, because the Pac-12, if you remember, was a part of it and was going to say, yeah, we're going to keep an eye on our members, and we're not going to poach anybody from you. And now all of a sudden they're joining up with the Big Ten, and the Pac-12 is. So I say the alliance is completely done. It's over. It's like the Death Star when it's exploded. It's gone. So I think for the other remainder, so the options are for the remaining conferences, for the other Power 5 schools, I really think the only avenue you could survive this in a big picture, like the whole movement of college football, where we're going, where I don't think we're going to stay at this 30, 32 number with just the Big Ten and the SEC. But I do think if you took the Power 5 schools that remain, this kind of Power 65, if you'll call them, there would be strength in numbers, where if the ACC, the Big 12, and the Pac-12 came together and said, but again, who do you trust now? Like if you had an alliance before, you're going to trust a new one? Not without a TV deal and not without a contract in place, because that was a handshake deal. But Amanda, I really think that's the only option on those teams to keep them relevant in the future of college football, is for the teams that aren't in the Big Ten or SEC and the forward movement of those 2 conferences to all combine collectively and say, we're going to make it a big 3. We're going to make 3 super conferences. We're going to be one of those. And I still don't think they have the powerhouses that the Big Ten and the SEC does. But with the likes of Clemson, Oregon, Florida State, Miami, Washington, the remainders, they could at least make a compelling case. But I think that is a pipe dream, Amanda. I really think we're going to evolve into 2 super conferences.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think if you, Danny mentioned the hypothetical with the Pac-12, the Big 12, ACC kind of combining strength in numbers, no question, but yet and still the tradition, looking at how the programs in the SEC and the Big Ten have been relevant for such a long time. I don't think they still can compete. And I think the biggest domino for all of this, when you look at the outside conferences, the ACC, the Pac-12, and the Big 12, whatever conference is lucky enough to go get Notre Dame, now you have a little sigh of relief. And if I'm the ACC, number one, you can't afford to lose Clemson, Florida State. But as Danny mentioned, Notre Dame has been, straddling the fence a little bit, 1 foot in with the conference, 1 foot out, doing their own thing when it comes to the independent side of things. If you can find a way to get Notre Dame to buy all the way in with the ACC, that would bring life to the ACC. But when it comes to the Pac-12 and the Big 12, I don't see any life happening, because I don't see Notre Dame considering any one of those conferences. The only 2 conferences I think Notre Dame would consider would be the ACC because they're already kind of doing business with them, or the Big Ten. And if that happens, like Danny said earlier, if the Big Ten finds a way to get Notre Dame, they're cooking with gas. If you know your way around the kitchen, gas stoves are the best stoves to cook on.
B-Mac, let me ask you, look at Danny's laughing too. B-Mac, when it comes to Notre Dame, I mean, first of all, we don't know what the playoffs are going to look like in the future. I mean, that was tabled here, and we're going to see what it looks like, though. But for Notre Dame right now, is it best to stay independent, or do they need to make a move?
I mean, that's a great question, because with them being independent, they bring in so much money, have their own TV deal. But with that being said, also, they have all the leverage. They have all the leverage when it comes to negotiating at the table. Listen, you need us more than we need you. So how can you make this deal sweet for us to consider going to your conference? So that's the power that Notre Dame has. Maybe they can negotiate. If we go to the Big Ten, as a hypothetical, we go to the Big Ten, we keep our TV deal. We don't split anything with the other universities in the conference, or negotiate the same thing with the ACC. So that's the luxury that Notre Dame has, because they're in a good situation regardless. That's the Irish, right? That's the gold helmets that resonates throughout college athletics, especially on the football field. So that's the big domino. If I'm the Big Ten, if I'm the ACC, clearly if I'm the ACC, how can we make this thing become a reality? How can we get you guys to 100% join our conference? Either side needs to be right now dialing up every number that's important when it comes to this decision with Notre Dame, because whatever conference gets Notre Dame, I mean, Notre Dame is the biggest free agent among free agents when it comes to college sports. If whatever conference can get them, man, now that's a heavy hit, especially if the Big Ten is able to do that. That would clearly put the Big Ten, in my opinion, over the SEC if they can go out and get Notre Dame.
Yeah, Notre Dame is the wild card right now that I think everybody's eyeballs should be on. And if you're Jim Phillips, the commissioner of the ACC, you're probably right now speed dialing Notre Dame to try to talk a deal like you're talking about, convince them to come to the conference. You hope you're not getting a busy signal. I don't even know, do we do those anymore? I don't know if we get busy signals anymore. But I think you're calling Notre Dame. You're also calling Clemson, Florida State, and Miami, your three biggest football brands, trying to ensure that you might get busy signal again with them, though, as they're probably pursuing interest in the Big Ten or SEC, most likely the SEC. So Jim Phillips right now, the commissioner of the ACC, has got a lot on his plate. But when it comes down to Notre Dame and the decision they're going to make, I think it comes down to two things. It comes down to money, and it comes down to playoff access. In either of those situations, I think the biggest windfall financially is to join one of these super conferences. They've always been a strong brand in college football, but with how big and how massive these TV deals are going to be with either the Big Ten or the SEC, I don't think as a single entity Notre Dame would come even close. And then for playoff access, that's the other one where I think it's going to force their hand with these two super conferences. They still might have a part of it, but if they want to guarantee they're a part of it, I do think they're going to have to join a conference. So I think the days of Notre Dame being an independent may be drawing to an end.
Danny Kannell, Bryant, McFadden, another day we did not see coming when it comes to the world of college football. But Danny, like you said, it took about a year to get here. So I'm not surprised it didn't happen a little bit earlier. Thank you guys so much. BMAC, if you did not know, has a podcast called All Things Covered. It is along with his cousin there, Patrick Peterson, latest episode talking to Darren Waller about his current contract situation, what he thinks the Raiders will look like this upcoming season, and be top 5 tight ends in the NFL.